Now we shall begin the last session for the conference. Session 4 will be conducted under the topic of role of sectoral bodies and institutions for global ocean commons. Without further hesitation, it is time to welcome our panelists for session number 4, and this session will be moderated by Her Excellency Frida M. Armas-Furter, Judge of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And Judge Armas-Furter, we invite you to begin.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, esteemed authorities, colleagues, students, and everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this fourth and final session of the 10th International Conference on the Law of the Sea. Before we begin, let me join others to thank deeply the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Korean Society of International Law, which co-organized this conference with the Tribunal. I would like to express my sincere thanks for their excellent organization and warm hospitality. And thank you also to all of you for staying with us through these very stimulating discussions. We are celebrating a decade of dialogue dedicated to understanding the expanding role of the Convention of UNCLOS and its institutions. And this ongoing dialogue underscores the essential truth that the law of the sea is not static. It is a continuously evolving framework. Our panel today will focus on the role of sectorial bodies and institutions for global ocean commons. And this is one of the most pressing governance challenges facing the global ocean commons. The governance of our ocean is characterized by a high degree of complexity, and consequently, it has resulted in a plethora of organizations with overlaying and overlapping roles. Effective management requires addressing these multiple sectoral problems in an unified and coherent manner, while states remain as the principal actors. To reflect on this issue, we have three distinguished speakers who will explore this challenge from three critical angles: the imperative of global coordination through the new BBNJ agreement, the foundation role of technology and data in deep sea governance, and the function of existing sectoral bodies in maintaining the legal order amidst rapid technological change. The common thread linking these presentations is the urgent need for a more integrated approach. We need to look forward to exploring how these institutions can fulfill their cooperation duties under the Convention and together strengthen the management of our oceans together. After the speakers, our three renowned discussants will offer reflections on the presentations. So let us begin with our first speaker, Professor Joanna MOSSOP. She's professor at the Victoria University of Wellington. I will also mention, for the relation with her presentation today, that Professor MOSSOP is co-editor of the commentary on the BBNJ agreement published by Oxford University Press just recently. Professor MOSSOP will lead us off by presenting the role of the BBNJ agreement in enhancing cooperation and coordination among instruments, frameworks, and bodies, prospects, and challenges. Professor MOSSOP, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. As with all the prior speakers, I would like to add my sincere thanks to the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Korean Society of International Law, and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. This is rapidly becoming one of my favourite conferences, especially when there's lobster on the buffet menu. So thank you very much for this invitation. Given the theme of the panel, I thought it might be appropriate to focus my paper on the role of the new BBNJ agreement. And for those unfamiliar with BBNJ, I'm talking here about the new agreement for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. And of course, as with everything in the law of the sea, that gets abbreviated to the BBNJ agreement. So in my paper, I will very briefly touch on the agreement as an introduction to any in the room who aren't aware of it. But then I will go on and talk about models of cooperation and coordination that might be applied to the new agreement. Currently in New York, there is a preparatory commission which is negotiating the rules of procedure for many of the bodies that are established by the agreement. And one of those issues will be how the agreement will foster cooperation and coordination. Before I move on to the substance, I just want to touch on something. Yesterday, Dr. Sender gave us a very positive view of the contribution of the United Nations to oceans governance. And it is very true that the last 50 years have been characterised by significant stability and comparable lack of conflict. But I want to just take a slightly different perspective on this and look at the fact that in 2019, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services issued a report that estimated that more than 1 million species is headed for extinction under the business as usual approach to managing our environment. And a large proportion of those species are likely to be marine species. So the ocean is facing a mix of very difficult issues, from warming of the ocean acidification, deoxygenation, as well as pressures from resource exploitation, particularly fisheries, where we are continually seeing a downward trend in that. So all of this has implications for food security and for the protection of the marine environment. And so I think it is useful to remind ourselves that there is a broader issue that needs addressing. So for those of you, there may only be a couple of you in the audience who are not aware of the BBNJ agreement. This agreement was concluded in 2023. It addresses 4 significant areas, including the access and benefit sharing of marine genetic resources found in areas beyond national jurisdiction. It provides a process for the establishment of area-based management tools and marine protected areas. It outlines a process for environmental impact assessment, and it also has provisions for improving capacity building and the transfer of marine technology to developing countries. It's been mentioned already during this conference, but the agreement will enter into force very soon in January next year. We needed 60 ratifications for it to enter into force, and we currently have 75, and I am sure that we will be seeing a rapid increase in that number as well. This is often referred to as the 3rd implementing agreement under the Law of the Sea Convention, but one of the really interesting differences between the first 2 implementing agreements and this agreement is the quite heavy institutional framework that it establishes, from a conference of the parties, a secretariat, a clearinghouse mechanism, a scientific and technical body, and 3 committees on various matters. So this is going to come into effect, and there will be a decision-making process and an opportunity for states to continue to work on issues that may arise. So in terms of the interrelationship between the new agreement and existing instruments, frameworks and bodies, which I will abbreviate to IFBs, a big issue during the negotiation was the instruction from the General Assembly not to undermine existing or relevant instruments, frameworks and bodies. And that has been very well embedded into the agreement. But at the same time, the Article 5, Paragraph 2 talks about both not undermining but also interpreting the agreement in a manner that promotes coherence and coordination with those instruments, frameworks and bodies. And the COP has an express duty to promote, through appropriate processes, cooperation and coordination with IFBs, with a view to promoting coherence. And this instruction and this function was very much prompted by the realisation that we have a plethora, as the judge referred to, of institutions that all overlap in relation to the ocean. And so some form of coordination needs to be done, and it was felt that the BBNJ agreement could perform this role. There are other provisions in the agreement that refer to cooperation and coordination, particularly in relation to area-based management tools, where the COP is to encourage coherence about area-based management, but also individual states parties have obligations to promote the objectives of the agreement in the international instruments, frameworks and bodies that they are party to. So this cooperation and coordination function is very central to what the BBNJ agreement is supposed to be achieving. And very quickly, I'll just show you a couple of images where people have tried to show in a visual form the number of instruments, frameworks and bodies that apply to areas beyond national jurisdiction in the oceans. And this one from the IPBES report focuses a lot on the more law of the sea-centric bodies, but you can also see that there are a number of multilateral environmental agreements that may very well apply and need to be coordinated with as well. And going back to our discussion on fragmentation from earlier, scholars don't necessarily consider the fact that there are these many bodies to be an issue. Polycentricity is something that is being acknowledged as a fine approach, but the important thing where you do have these many models is there needs to be a mechanism for coordination so that each of those the instruments are not undermining each other. So in thinking about what the models of cooperation might be out there, I drew some inspiration from a fellow Kiwi academic, although also from the UK, Karen Scott, who a while back now wrote a very useful chapter in which she categorised a whole variety of cooperation and coordination mechanisms that exist in multilateral environmental agreements, but also she covered the law of the sea. So one model that she identified, and probably the most common model, is a very basic level of cooperation and primarily involves formal and informal arrangements, usually between the secretariats of various treaty bodies, but with the endorsement of the states parties to exchange information and to cooperate, including one example of the Bern process, which was an informal process aimed at facilitating discussions for parties to the biodiversity conventions. And the goals of that process included identifying areas of cross-cutting importance, possible elements for increased synergies. We can also see this with the UN Oceans approach, but I'm going to come back to that shortly. The second category of cooperation that Karen identified was a more integrated approach. And this is a situation where there are broader and deeper cooperation activities. And she referred to the Kobe process between the 5 tuna RFMOs, which attempts to address issues that are not able to be addressed alone by individual regional fisheries management organisations. However, probably the best example of a more integrated approach is the cooperation between the Bern, Rotterdam and Stockholm conventions, which have essentially developed an enhanced synergies process where they coordinate meetings, they have integrated secretariat functioning and have tried to work together to develop their work program. This is sometimes known as a clustering of instruments, frameworks and bodies. So the positive of that is that this sort of process and close cooperation can lead to improved learning and improved synergies, although it has to be recognised that all of those organisations have their own mandates and goals, and that can sometimes interfere. I'm not going to dwell on the third category. I'm happy to answer questions about that. So one of the examples of a coordination function is demonstrated in the UN Oceans process, and that was mentioned, I think, yesterday as well. And its stated goal is that it aims to strengthen and promote coordination and coherence of UN system activities related to the ocean. And there are currently 33 organisations affiliated with the UN both from Law of the Sea, but also environmental organisations, as well as organisations that have some impact on the oceans, but probably relatively peripheral. An academic who has looked at this argues that it has unfortunately been a rather lacklustre coordination effort and has been hampered by a lack of funding, which of course limits what such a coordination function can do. And so, if we were going to use UN Oceans as a coordination mechanism, it probably isn't currently fit for purpose, even taking into account the fact that there are Law of the Sea institutions like fisheries organisations and the International Whaling Commission who are not part of that process because they are not directly UN affiliates. So what are some of the things that a BBNJ agreement could try and aim for if it wants to promote coordination? Well, at a very basic level, of course, the exchange of information about science, about activities in the ocean, is in itself potentially a useful approach. Potentially participation in meetings by the secretariats of each other's organisation might be a way of trying to ensure some cohesion. But then you can sort of move on to slightly more integrated approaches, including joint programs of work, having liaison staff that are directly responsible for improving coordination, having coordinated meetings, coordination between the subsidiary bodies, potentially secretariat integration, although that's probably a very long way down the track. And so there's a number of different ways in which the existing cooperation mechanisms might give us ideas about how this might occur. But of course, there's always going to be potential risks as well as potential benefits when you're trying to enhance cooperation and coordination. So many of the potential benefits essentially contribute to the idea that this might be if you bring organisations together and work together, that you get something that is greater than the sum of the parts, that by providing a coordinated approach, then somehow the potential inconsistencies and incoherencies might be ironed out. For example, so one organisation might take steps to protect an area of the ocean, whereas another organisation might be planning to exploit it in a way that might be harmful to the marine environment, and this might be a way in which some of those issues can be sorted out. It also allows for learning, and I actually think we're starting to see some of the influence of different regimes already being felt in the way that IFBs are responding to the conclusion of the BBNJ agreement. It will be important that states parties to the IFBs are fully in support of any cooperation approach that is taken, and that may very well be the biggest limitation on early adoption of cooperation. Definitely the involvement of state parties as well as the Secretariat, I think, is very important. So what are the risks? What are the obstacles that might stand in the way of improving cooperation and coordination? And it's actually easy to see quite a few at even just a first glance. So one issue, of course, is that there will be parties involved in IFBs who are not party to the BBNJ agreement. And they may look with some suspicion at the attempt by the BBNJ parties to try to take the lead in cooperation and coordination, for fear that they might be somehow drawn into a situation in which they're somehow accepting the BBNJ agreement and being bound by it in some way. There might be a concern about an IFB overreaching its mandate if it becomes involved in these cooperation mechanisms. There may be a concern that there might be dominance by one state or group of states, or even dominance by one institution, and the fact that the BBNJ agreement has this mandate means that it needs to be very sensitive to the idea that other IFBs may not want to be seen to be subordinate to the BBNJ, even though technically it's not in any way hierarchically above those other institutions. And it's going to be very important for states parties to coordinate their approaches to these various institutions so that their positions are coherent within state parties in these different IFBs. And of course, we have the problem that there are different organisations with various mandates and objectives. Just very quickly touching on some of the responses by IFBs to the conclusion of the BBNJ agreement, we can see various approaches that have been taken. And I've got a few sort of summaries from various institutions, and the first is the International Seabed Authority, where the Secretary-General was very clear that it has an exclusive mandate to organise activities in relation to the area, but was still open to working with the BBNJ agreement, and I think we might hear a bit more about that shortly. On the other hand, the Antarctic Treaty System parties have repeatedly confirmed that they see themselves as having the exclusive mandate to regulate activities in the Antarctic Treaty area, and were unable even to agree to a resolution welcoming the adoption of the BBNJ agreement. And then the tuna RFMOs, I think, are the most open of the responses, where they said, yes, we have a mandate, but we do want to be involved, and actually we should be first to be consulted with. So there's very varying approaches to how these organisations are responding. So what are the lessons? Well, one thing that is very clear from the existing examples that Karen identified in her chapter is that very rarely does one organisation take the lead. Usually it's a process, it's given a name, rather than it being all underneath one body. And so I think that is one thing that the BBNJ parties might want to think about, is whether or not they lead with the BBNJ agreement or facilitate some other form of structure, or even maybe using the UN Oceans process in a more expanded way. And I do think that we're going to be need to be relatively humble. I think the BBNJ parties need to be careful not to be seen to be wanting to force other organisations into a form of cooperation, coordination they're not ready for, and that starting small can sometimes be the best way to develop trust and confidence in the process. I think that there are opportunities, especially around area-based management tools and planning based on area-based management, such as strategic environmental assessments, that might be an early sort of rallying call. But I do think that we should not be creating any expectations on the PrepCom to establish any particular models. I'm really putting this forward as a way that this can proceed in the future. I won't dwell on this because I'm almost out of time, but the one thing that I think would be very interesting to think about is what are relevant instruments, frameworks and bodies. Initially, the proposal was for existing instruments, frameworks and bodies to be referred to. Now it's relevant instruments, frameworks and bodies. And for cooperation and coordination purposes, we can probably cast the net relatively wide. If any organisation thinks it's relevant, then it should be able to cooperate and coordinate. But there are functions within the agreement where the not undermine refers to the competence of these bodies, and we might want to think about what are the criteria that we would apply to determining whether we need to observe the competence of these other bodies. So, to conclude, I would offer a note of optimism and a note of caution. I think that the fact that this BBNJ agreement now has the mandate to improve cooperation and coordination offers enormous potential. How it does that, I think, is going to determine how successful it might be. And we have to acknowledge that previous efforts to improve coordination and cooperation have been very superficial. So my advice essentially is to keep the idea of legitimacy in mind and make sure that you bring along the entire international community and not just the parties to the BBNJ agreement. And that is going to require strategic thinking and consideration of goals and processes. I'll just This is the cover of the book that Frida very kindly mentioned. So that was published last week. So thank you. Kamsahamnida.
Well, thank you very much for your comprehensive and insightful presentation.